Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 5 of mya222, Maya Foundations, Look Dev and Development. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to start in Nuke and we're going to continue looking at our high dynamic range workflow. So you can see here I have two images. This is my background plate, which has a Macbeth chart in it, and this is my HDR, which also has a Macbeth chart. Now what you'd normally want to do is you'd want to shoot the Macbeth charts actually in the environment when you took the photography. Unfortunately, both these background plate and the HDR didn't have a Macbeth chart in them at the time, so I've added it through way of illustration. Okay, but to do this properly you always want to have the Macbeth charts there when you take the photograph. Obviously we're not going to be hyper accurate for what we're doing because the Macbeth chart's been added afterwards, but the workflow remains the same, and therefore you can take away actually how to do it from this, even though what I'm doing isn't going to be exactly artistically correct or technically correct. So the first thing we need to do is we actually need to color correct the HDR, which is this, to the background plate. That's the first thing we always need to do, because the background plate that we see here is kind of the master. So the way we're going to do this is we're actually going to cut out the Macbeth chart from this image. So I'm going to do this because it's an HDR. I'm going to use a spherical transform, and I'm going to say lat long to cubic. And you can see here we have our image. And what I can do is I can just use this to kind of scroll around and try and get this in the middle of the frame. I want to try and get it as straight as I can. So I get it in the middle there, and I can also just rotate round here. You kind of want to see whether you can get it squarish. Now it doesn't matter if you can't, but this will be probably pretty good for what we need. I'm then going to do a crop, and I'm just going to crop out the Macbeth straight out of this image. Then I'm going to do a reformat, and I'm going to reformat this to a new setup. I'm going to do it, say, 600 across, so this will be 600, or I guess 0.6k, so 600 across by 300. And I want to do a distort. And then the final thing I'm going to do is a corner pin, and I'm going to use my corner pin just to bring this into the roughly the right size and kind of aspect ratio. So somewhere like that. Now it doesn't need to be exact, because obviously the key is the color, but we want to get it roughly usable. So say somewhere like that. So we now have our Macbeth chart, which I'm going to do one more crop just to get rid of the B-box. And I can now add that over the top of my background plate here. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to actually probably try and move this as well. So I'm going to move this one out the way. So I'm going to again just crop this down, and you'll see why I'm going to do this in a moment. I'm going to actually keep the bounding box for this one the same, but I just need a quick way of moving this. So I'm going to crop this, I'm going to do a merge, and I'm going to merge this over the background, and we probably want to keep this here in the middle. So we'll bring this to here, and then I'm just going to add a transform. So if I view this, you can see I can now move this up, which is all I really want to do. I just want to put it to there. Okay, from there, I'm going to now merge in my image from here, and I'm going to add a transform, And all of this really is literally being done to put these together. Okay, so this needs to come over here. I need to scale it down. And I could also do with just revolving it round. So let's just do a revolve. Probably a flip's going to be the best option. So let's just, before we do this, do a reformat. And we want to set it to scale. And we just want to do a flip like so. Now remember, these are going to concatenate. So we want to keep these all together. And the corner pin, I can't remember whether that concatenates, I could look it up, but it's not important for what we're doing. So I want to put this here. So you can see what we've done. We've literally now got these lined up. Okay, so we don't care about the other piece at the bottom. All we're interested in now is this. So what we want to do now is take our lat long and color correct this into the background plate. So we've got all our transforms here. I'm then going to add a grade node. And let's begin by just doing a gain. So you can see we can kind of gain that up. And we want to look at kind of the red, green and blue. Sometimes you can come in and maybe just adjust this a little bit to get it right in position. And we could also probably crop this a little bit more. So if we come back to our crop here and just view that. Back to our normal RGB, and let's just crop this in just a little bit more. Somewhere like that will be just fine. And come back to our corner pin, and this is just going to need to be corrected after we've now cropped it down. So the idea behind this is that we want to try and get these colors really close so that they actually kind of sit on top of each other. So you can see now they're right on top of each other, so it makes it a little bit easier just to see what we're doing. So let's just adjust this a little bit. So that's getting close. We could also come in and using the Molt tool, we could actually begin to try and match these. So you can see we're getting really close now. So red is close, green, and blue is the one that's out. So let's bring in, adjust the blue. Back to red, green. Back to red, green, and blue. So they're looking pretty good. Now, it may all be a little bit too light. So we can bring it down a little bit. Somewhere like that. Now this usually you want to do and take your time over it. But in this grade node now, we've managed to get these two really close. Okay, the closer you get them, the better. Now you can see if we now look at the grade, how it's affecting our lat long. So I'm going to bring it here, just add it, view this, and you can see with this on and off, the difference we're getting. And that's what we need. We want to get this graded to match the background. So now these are really close. Good enough for us to continue working on. Okay, so that's the first stage, this grade. So we're going to take this, I'll put it over here, and I'm going to add a background backdrop here, and we're going to call this master HDRI grade. So we remember that that is kind of what we're going to be outputting from. I'm just going to set my normal colors and close that down. Okay, so from here, the next step is to basically extract any of the lights that we think we want to contribute to the scene as individual localized lights. So obviously a key one is this one. So let's look at how we would do that. It's pretty straightforward. First thing we want to do is we want to just gain this down so we can actually see where the light is. Now in doing this, there's always decisions to make. The question is, how much actual kind of additional light that is around the light emitting object do you use? Now for this, if we come here, you can see we've got a lot of kind of additional glow, but when we stop down, we can clearly see that it's coming from this shape. Now because this is a lamppost with nothing behind it for a very long way, obviously just the tree and then the sky, I would in this instance just crop the light itself. However, if you have a light that's say on a wall, and the light is emitting light from the light bulb bouncing off of the wall and creating kind of a glow from the wall itself, I may include some of the glow that's actually bouncing off the wall, because it feels to me like that's also emitting light. The other good thing you can do is actually come in and actually see how much light is being emitted by just going full frame, so we can see all of our tools, and I can come in here and I can say exposure, and you can see actually all of this area is over 1. So you can see even here right at the edge, this is 1.2, 1.4, until we get right into the middle, then it just goes huge. But you can see the difference between here, which is around 1,000, just a little way across, it suddenly drops to 400, and then 25, 20, 18. So you can see once you get out of the initial glow, you're really kind of dropping the amount of high dynamic range. So I would really just crop reasonably close to this. That would be the way I would look to do this one. So I'm going to add a crop node, connect it into my master grade, and let's just go ahead and crop this down. So I'm going to move this over here and just crop into this. Now what you normally want to do is you actually want to end up with this roughly in the right orientation. So obviously this is at a 45-degree angle. What I could really do with is rotating this. So let's just turn off my crop for a moment. I'm going to add a transform node, and I'm going to transform this around the center of this light. So I'm going to hold down the control and move this right into the middle. Make sure I hold control so I don't actually move the image. In fact, I could maybe do it from the bottom, and then I can use this to rotate the light around, and you can see that it keeps dropping out of the kind of exposure that I've set. So somewhere like that is probably okay. I can just do a quick test. See, that's going to be fine. So let's drop back to here, come back to our crop node, and now we can adjust this in a more sensible way. Now, normally you want to set this to be roughly the right size. So somewhere like so would be just right for this. And then I'm going to reformat it so I end up with the actual crop of just the light, and that gives me that. And when I take off the exposure, you can see it just really blows out, but that's fine. So this gives me a size of 188 by 30. What I tend to do is maybe after this do a reformat or even a scale. I might do a reformat, and I'm just going to set this to scale. And I'm going to nudge this up by a little bit, because I tend to try and work on a number that kind of makes sense in my mind. So 200 by 32 is quite good. Now I also don't think it's really bad to adjust the scale of this in a proportionate method. So there's no reason why we can't scale this down to 200 by 30, something like that. Let's see if we set it to 0.2, there we go, 0.1. So this now becomes a number that I can kind of remember. So this becomes our first key light. So I'm going to add a backdrop, and we're going to come in and I'm going to name this. So this is street light, And I also, just for kind of visual purposes, put down the size. So it's 200 by 30, or you could just say 20 by 3. That's the aspect ratio. And I always go again with 30, and I'll just set this again to just a nice color for the backdrop. And just stretch that out a little bit. Okay, so there's our first set of lights, or our first light that we're going to use. Now what we want to do now is we actually want to remove that light from our main HDR now, the lat long image. So this can be done through obviously any number of ways. What I'm going to do is I'm probably just going to add some sky behind it, or you could just clone some trees over it. It really doesn't make any difference. Obviously this is for lighting purposes, it's not for reflections. If it was for reflections, you would probably want to be a little bit cleaner and more tidy about it. But I'm going to just go with a roto node here, and in my roto I'm going to come in and I'm going to add a B-spline. I'm going to come somewhere here. So I'm just coming right around the object, something like that. It doesn't obviously again need to be exact. Now if I look in my alpha channel, you can see, as long as I'm viewing it, there is my alpha channel that I'm going to use. And what I need to do is I'm going to add after this from the draw menu this marker removal. And what this is going to do is it's going to look at the alpha channel, and it's going to basically use that as an area to suck in area of RGB from around, which is going to fill in my area in the middle. So if you watch, there goes my light. Now it's obviously not an absolutely perfect job, but we have got that reasonably covered. So it's no longer high dynamic range. If we come in and we begin to adjust the feather, you can see that you can basically affect how much is getting drawn in. So you need to be kind of careful. But that's probably going to be just fine. That's all we really need. These lines are always kind of an artifact of just using this tool. Another method obviously would be if we took the roto and we, instead of making it alpha, we could make it RGB. We could change the shape from color, which is now just putting a white image on top, to background. And now it's taking the background, it's filling in the channel, or the mask rather, with the background, and so you're ending up with the background in the mask in the same place. But now I could do this offset here, and you can see that I'm actually able to begin to adjust this. If I made this say 10, you can see now as I adjust this, there is the tree coming in. So again, that may be slightly better, and I could come in and I could actually feather this if I wanted to. So you can see as I just feather this out, again this is going to just need to be adjusted. And we've done a pretty good job again of getting rid of that. So it really depends kind of which way you want to go. Got that method or this method. Probably this one's fine. Again, for reflections, this obviously is clearly not going to work because we don't want this weird shape reflected in our object. But for making this image for the lat long, for lighting, this is going to be just fine. So what I tend to now do is just have a look around at the image and see what else needs to be grabbed. So I'm going to put on exposure, and I can clearly see here I've got a lot of high dynamic range here. Here again. So these lights could be really useful. This light over here, really high again. So I may choose to grab that one, grab this one, and then down here. So the next thing we want to do is really begin to strip out more of these lights. So I'm going to grab a few more offline and just kind of do the same thing that I've done with this one, just so we end up with probably one, maybe 2 or 3 more lights that we're going to use. So I'm going to do that now as you've got the hang of kind of how this works. Okay, so let me show you what I've done now. I've gone in and taken out some of the lights. So obviously the one we just looked at was this one, that was the main street light. I've also done one of the street lights in the back and another one. I've done the houses here plus some street lights, and they all felt like they were kind of on the same plane, a long way back, but roughly on the same plane. Obviously there is some distance, but they were so far back the distance was minimal, so I just combined all these. I then took the phone box as well, and that had some really bright lights. You can see that goes right up to 224 in the blue, but over 1,471 in the red, so really bright, the phone box. Then the house with the lights again, this is well over 1,000 for some of these lights. So that's given me a whole bunch of images there that we can use. And I'm just going to spread these out a little bit, just to give ourselves a little bit more room. What I then did was I went in and did some cleanup. So first of all, obviously we looked at the roto and the marker removal, and I used that again down here. Okay, then on this one I did just some straightforward roto. You can see that's over here, so I just did a roto, did it as background and then just cloned it with an offset, and then I did a roto paint on the phone booth over here. So you can see there's the roto paint here. Once they were done, these two, I then clamped everything. And what I've done is I've taken the whole image and I've clamped it to 0 to 2. So we still have some dynamic range, but it's pretty small. The lowest is going to be a value of 2 as opposed to over 1,000. And then I came in and I blurred the whole image. And this just kind of smooths everything out. You could probably blur it more than this, but I'm pretty happy with that. So that gives me one main HDR and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lights that we're going to use. So I'm going to save all these out as 32-bit OpenEXR files that are going to be labeled the same as I have them here in Nuke, and then we can use those in Maya. So let's do that section. So I'm just going to come in and do write. I'm going to just save it into my HDR folder, and this first one is obviously main street light. And I'm probably going to just use underscores here. I guess you could use camel, but I think it should be just fine. So EXR. And it needs to be 32-bit. So 32-bit EXR. And I'm going to render that one out. So that's just going to take a few seconds to run through. This is obviously the big one. The reason why it takes a bit of time is obviously having to render the blur, and it's a pretty big image. So once this is done, I'm then going to go out and save out the other images as well. Okay, so that's done. So I've made all of these outputs and rendered them out. And you can see here in the folder I've now got all of the images. So I've got the main HDR, the original. I've got the house lights on both sides of the road. I've got the main street light, the main blurred HDR with the lights removed, the phone box, street light 02 and street light 03. So I've now got everything I need, and we can save our Nuke scene and head on over to Maya to begin to put these in place. Okay, so here we are in Maya. And I've done a little bit of initial setup just because it would have taken too long to do in the class. So let me show you what we've got. I'm going to move across to the perspective view. You can see that we have a scene here. This represents the road layout that we had in our main image. So I'm just going to drop across to wireframe. So this is the road layout. This is where the camera was that took the background plate. And these are the positions and roughly the right size of all the elements. So over here we've got that house, approximately the right size. Obviously we've got the house and some road signs as well, some street lights rather. Another street light here. Here we have the telephone box. We may choose just to rotate that around a little bit. We've got the main street light there. We've got the street light over here, which is the one you actually see up here in the background plate. So you can see if we just turn that off and zoom in, there's that street light. So that one is that one. And then over here we have one more street light. And what I've basically looked to do is position them all based on the actual real world sizes of the street and their position. And this is very important because obviously if we're trying to get our lights to work correctly, they need to be in a correct physical space. Now this road layout that I've got here obviously fits the image, but if you were doing something, no doubt you're going to need to take some measurements of the set, of the environment, and in larger companies it wouldn't be unusual for them to take what's called a LiDAR scan, which is basically kind of like a laser scan of the entire area, and that could be quite a large area depending on how big the set is. So for our setup, this is what we've got. So when I look through the camera, you can see here is our first light. Now this, no doubt, as you can see, is a rabbit. It's not just any rabbit, it is in fact the Stanford bunny, which is a very historically important rabbit. And what you can see is it's sat on some grass here. Now this grass is just paint effects grass that I have used just to give something for the rabbit to cast shadows onto. I could have obviously gone in and used a plane, but that would have given us a very flat set of shadows, and we really want shadows that are going to be undulating based on the surface of the grass. So I'm actually using grass with used background on, which is obviously what we used on the shelf when we did our teapot setup. So really all we need to do from here is we need to take the exported texture maps that were the HDRs, and we want to apply those directly onto our pieces of geometry. So let's start with this one here. I'm just going to do a couple and then I'll do the rest offline. So what I tend to do is I tend to use a favorite, which is a surface shader. Now, I know that was just off the bottom, but if you've used Maya for any amount of time, you're going to be very familiar with a surface shader. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to say my out color. I'm going to choose a file and I'm going to come in and I'm just going to load that texture map. So HDR, and if you remember, it is the main street light, this one here. So if I say OK, that's going to load in. Now it's important here that you note that the color space isn't sRGB, it's in fact raw, so that needs to be set to raw there. Okay, now if we go ahead and render this, what we should see is the texture on here. So I'm just going to render that now, and there you can see that texture. Okay, so that's immediately going to begin to cast some illumination into the scene once we switch on a few things. And let's probably go ahead and do that just so you can see what's happening. So firstly, I'm going to switch back to the camera. And remember, that light is kind of directly behind our rabbit here in the scene. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that because we don't have any actual real lights in here, we need to tell Maya not to throw in its own default light. So this is the enable default light. We want that off. We then want to say that our quality is just going to be 0.25. That's fine. Then we're going to say the indirect GI diffuse is going to be on. And I might turn these down to 0.5 as well, just for speed. Now let's go ahead and render this and see what we now get. We may or may not get to see anything at this point because obviously we have one light and it may not be bright enough. So let's see what we get. It may in fact be too bright. Let's see. Well, it looks like we are definitely getting something. We're actually beginning to get some illumination on our rabbit. Now it's quite grainy, mainly because of the fact that we've got very low render quality. So you can see there it is. We're actually getting some illumination on our rabbit. Now the next step is to go in and add the texture maps to all of the lights. So that's what I'm going to do next. Okay, so I've gone in and I've added textures now to all of the cards. So we now should get all of the contribution of the lights from all the HDRs. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to render this, and it's probably going to take a little bit of time. I've upped the render quality, so you can see here I've pushed everything to 2 just to guarantee that we're going to get a nice result at the end of the day for this. Now if we wanted to, we could come in and we could potentially choose to actually drop the amount of brightness for some of the lights. So we could do that obviously by coming in to our actual map here, and we could go to color balance and we could drop the color gain. Now if I was going to do this, I would want to make sure that all of my color gains were being controlled at the same time, because I don't want to take one light down more than another light. I would just want to make the whole scene lighter or darker. So if I wanted to do that, I would probably use something like set driven key or connection editor to connect the gain of all the colors together, just so that when you did one, as I said, it does all of them. Now the other thing we haven't included is the general HDR, so I'm going to add that in as well at this point before we do what I'm hoping will be our kind of final render. So I'm going to say image based lighting, and I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to grab the main HDR and open that up, and that should go in there. So we should be just fine for that. And if you remember, just momentarily moving back to Nuke, what we're loading in is this blurred image here. Okay, so that's what we're loading in. So that's gone in, and one thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to say under the render stats that I do not want the primary visibility being seen there. Also for my actual rabbit itself, it would be good to have some kind of useful texture on that. I've just got a Lambert, so I'm going to right click, I'm going to go with a new material just off the bottom. I'm going to go with a mental ray MIA material X, and we're just going to go with a reflection of 0.1, glossiness I may bring down to something like 0.4, that looks nice, and the brightness I'm going to drop down somewhere in the middle is obviously going to get us a kind of a 0.5, but I'm going to go slightly lower, 0.35, somewhere like so perhaps. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit render and see what we get. Okay, so that's gone through. It did take quite a long time. I pushed the sliders up pretty high, 16 minutes, but you can see what we've got is a very realistic looking lit, what really is kind of like a porcelain rabbit. Now there is still a little bit of noise, and that noise is really due to the fact that some of these texture maps are really high. So one of the things you could do if you find that you have these little fireflies on your surface is either blur the initial texture before you save it, or just drop the value down. So we had values at 1500 in Nuke. You might want to drop those down to maybe something like 800 or 750, something like that, and that will definitely help if you're finding you're getting fireflies. These things that we're seeing here, these actually aren't fireflies. These are the actual spec hits of the lights behind the rabbit and where the houses are and things like that. But generally, I'm pretty pleased with what this is looking like. It's looking very realistic. Now, before we finish up, the only thing that we probably ought to do, and I didn't do, is we would need to make sure that the HDR that we put in is actually round the right way. So if we just zoom out, you can see here is our HDR, and we want to make sure that the the HDR is actually facing the correct way. Now at the moment it's a little bit difficult to work out which way is which. I believe probably that needs to rotate round a little bit, but we probably want something like a minus 90 degrees, something like that, just to make sure that the HDR itself is actually in the correct location orientation wise. Now that's obviously going to make quite a lot of difference to the final output. Now our HDR is pretty small in regards to the amount of color information. It's only at 2 stops, if you remember. We had it clamped to 2, but it will make some kind of contribution. So it's one thing you want to do is make sure that's rotated, and you can see this is kind of now beginning to match up. Okay, you can see everything going across. So this is really as far as you want to take this. The next stage, which we're not going to do, would be to maybe adjust the brightness of all these lights. And as I said earlier, you want to do that so they're all balanced. So if you're going to drop them to say 0.9 or 0.8, you want to make sure all of them are being dropped at the same amount. Other than that, you're in a good place. You've got now very realistic lighting, correctly proportioned based on the locality of your scene. Everything is working nicely. You're actually using the high dynamic range information locally. So if the rabbit was to move around or something was to move in front of the rabbit, instead of having all the light being generated by this basically infinitely sized sphere around everything, things are actually in their physical location. So we've got physically based shaders, we've got physically based HDR, and we've got physically based locations of our lights. So we're really in the best position we can be. The only thing that you could do differently, and I've had this discussion with people in the past, if you have an interior scene, you could actually potentially take HDR tiles and rebuild entire areas of the inside environment. And then you would use those textures to actually texture map the inside of the environment, so that each wall, as opposed to just a light, the entire environment itself has an HDR texture that then basically emits light into the scene. Now this has been done by a number of people. If you ever watch the film Moon, that was done quite early on by the company that worked on that, and they had for the interior of the space station all HDRs on the environment itself. But also a friend of mine, Scott, if you've seen any of his videos, he does a lot of stuff with the Foundry. He's done quite a famous one with V-Ray, Mari and Nuke, where he basically texture maps this kind of, I guess it's like a loft or an attic, and he creates an entire environment made out of high dynamic range textures. So again, that's really worth watching. I think an FX Guide TV was done on that, so you can go and have a look at that. But that really takes us to the end of this class. If you had any questions about anything, then please put them in the forums, and I will look forward to answering them as quickly as I can. But until then, until next week, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.